Now, you'll hear a lot of people talk about like weight loss, weight gain leading to high cholesterol, inactivity. Honestly, those variables have a pretty small effect.
Really?
Weight gain, for example, might raise other markers, blood sugar especially, but it's not affecting the LDL. What seems to really affect it is actually saturated fat intake. So high blood pressure means that you just have a lot of pressure in the artery. That can lead to some issues, like hemorrhagic stroke. It can increase your risk for a heart attack. One of the factors that seems to raise it is actually a high salt intake, familial hypercholesterolemia. That runs in families. Now, there are people who don't have that genetic disease. If it does run in the family like that, if it's difficult to get it down with nutrition, and medication might be the way to go. The mantra with LDL cholesterol is typically the lower, the earlier, the longer, the better. My concern with people adopting ketogenic diets is that they often do a very animal-based, very high saturated fat version. And in fact, we have a study that came out a couple of years ago, healthy young women who were put on the dietary guidelines, overall healthy diet, or animal-based keto diet. And man, their LDL cholesterol shot up. Theirs got so high that it could be mistaken for a familial hypercholesterolemia.
Wow. Is it worth buying organic food?
No, I don't think so at all.
I was really surprised to see your video about coffee and dehydration.
Yeah, everyone thinks it's dehydrating. That's not true.
Okay, so Dr. Matthew, let's take it back to the start of your career. What inspired you to become a naturopathic doctor, and specifically with a plant-based nutrition focus? And perhaps there's two parts to this. There's the plant-based element, but also why naturopathy as opposed to just being a regular doctor?
Yeah, so let's do the plant-based vegan part first. So when I was younger, I had some health issues. I struggled with weight. I had asthma that at points was pretty bad. Some skin issues and whatnot. And my personal trainer at the time, I was training for football, American football. I also play soccer and I have my whole life. I was doing martial arts. Like I was training a lot. And, I always struggled to lose the weight, but I was working with this trainer and he really recommended a more plant-based diet. He was actually big into like the raw foods and stuff, but he wasn't like strictly plant-based or anything. And at a point he wanted me to record everything that I ate, to do like a food diary. And my diet was so bad at the time that I kind of wanted to fool him a little bit. So I didn't lie on the food diary, but I actually changed my diet. Yeah, so I cut out the dairy, I cut out all the classic sort of, junk foods, as many call them. And I started losing weight. I was, feeling better, breathing better, skin was clearing up. So I thought, hey, maybe this guy's onto something. And I just kind of stuck with it ever since then. I was 15 at the time. And over the course of the next couple of years, I just kept diving more and more into nutrition. And I'm sure I, went down some roads that maybe weren't so evidence-based as well, but I was a teenager and I was learning. And a couple of years later, when I went to university, I noticed that my diet, just even how I felt, was kind of slipping the other way. I was eating cafeteria food because it was what was available. I was, drinking on the weekends and stuff with all my friends. And at a point in my second semester, I was there in the cafeteria. I remember it super well. I had, I just eaten chicken or it was still on my plate, but one of the two. And I just looked at my friend. I was like, you know what? I think I'm going vegan. Like just overnight, I'm going vegan. And he was like, what? And so I was like, yeah, I think I'm doing it. And, no one really thought it would last. And here we are 12 and a half years later from that day, and have been ever since. And I really survived at that time, especially where there wasn't as many options around. I survived on a blender in my room, a Vitamix in my room, a mini fridge that I had in my room. And then I used my food card for the cafeteria for all the like salads and stuff, the salad bar. I just would pack in all that as much as I could too. So, yeah, it's obviously a different time than it is now, but that's how I transitioned.
So it's pretty much just over a cafeteria break.
Yeah, sort of. But it was also like those couple years leading up to it, I had dove into that a lot, like the plant-based nutrition side. I just hadn't been, 100% strict with it, right? Mm-hmm. So I kind of knew what to do, but it's obviously a lot more difficult when you are living on campus and eating out of a cafeteria. But yeah, so that's how I made that change. And then moving into my career choice, also while I was at that university, I was thinking about going into medicine or somewhere in healthcare. But I also, after all of these changes I had made and how much benefit I'd seen, and my dad actually had some issues with his heart health as well, that he seemed to do a lot better with after implementing some nutritional changes. So I wanted to do something with nutrition as well. And one of my instructors or one of my teachers actually suggested, hey, why don't you shadow my naturopath? She had a couple, and I'd known a little bit about it. I don't know what it's like over in the UK. In fact, I don't think it's regulated in the UK. So kind of anybody can call themselves that. But here in BC, it is a regulated profession. We do get, doctor in front of our name and whatnot. And so I shadowed them, and I thought, wow, there's like such a big scope here. They can prescribe medications. They can do the nutrition counseling. They can do physical therapies even for like injury rehabilitation. And these are all things that I was really interested in. And there are parts of the scope that I don't care for at all. And I just don't practice them. So I focus on those areas that I think are more evidence-based and things that I enjoy more and I think have more utility for the types of people or types of patients that I see. So that's ultimately why I decided to go that route.
Amazing. And then the plant-based focus as a naturopathic doctor just became a natural blend.
Yeah, exactly. And I see tons of people with things like high cholesterol, high blood pressure, diabetes, or blood sugar issues. And we're able to often address a lot of that through nutrition. And hey, sometimes medication's needed too. It's not always one or the other. In fact, both together can often lead to the best outcome.
Well, those health conditions you just raised are a common concern for many of our listeners. And it's oftentimes the reason why they want to make a change, but they also may have a lot of family who are struggling with these health issues. For those in their sort of late 30s, 40s, maybe early 50s, what key markers do you need to pay attention to when it comes to cardiovascular disease and diabetes specifically?
Well, for diabetes, that's an easy one. The main marker that's usually tested for that is called hemoglobin A1C. So you're essentially measuring how many of these sugar molecules are on your red blood cells or on the hemoglobin on your red blood cells. And the higher your blood sugar is on average, the higher that number will get. So you can kind of check it every 3 to 4 months and see what has the average been over the previous time period. And so you want to keep that in obviously a healthy range. Now, so that's one that you can check. And I think that's one that most doctors will check if they're just doing kind of a general checkup. Now, for cardiovascular disease, there's a few. For one, blood pressure, super easy to measure, right? It's a huge risk factor for not just cardiovascular disease, but premature death overall and many other diseases like Alzheimer's and whatnot. So you can check it at a pharmacy. I don't know over there if they have them at grocery stores. Over here, you just go to the grocery store and they have the blood pressure.
Yeah, it's pretty easy to access.
Yeah,
it's not necessarily at a grocery store, but you can buy them yourself. Yeah.
So it's super easy to test. And you can check that. And I mean, normal is 120 over 80. And just so you know, that top number is the pressure as your heart pumps blood through the artery. And the bottom number is when it's in a resting state, so not actively pumping. So you want to have, 120 over 80 or lower is considered normal. But what might actually be ideal is 110 over 70 or lower. And now, obviously, you can get too low to the point that you get lightheaded and faint, and that. So you don't want to be crazy low if you're getting those symptoms either. But otherwise, generally lower than that 110 over 70. Now, the other one to test, or the other one that's often tested on a blood test, is called LDL cholesterol. So LDL cholesterol is a measure of the amount of cholesterol that's being carried by these proteins, or lipoproteins, they're called LDL, low density lipoprotein. And those LDL particles, they have another protein on it called ApoB that can interact with your artery wall, kind of hold it in this, what's called the subintimal space, or subendothelial space, in the artery wall. And then once it's held there, it'll eventually down the road develop into a plaque. There's a few processes that it goes through. So you want to keep your LDL cholesterol low enough that you don't have much of that actually entering into the artery wall and leading to atherosclerosis down the road, or plaque development down the road. So you can measure that. And actually, I'm going to put out a post on this very soon, but the ideal number is under 1.8 millimoles per liter, or 70 milligrams per deciliter if anyone's listening from the United States. I know that's what they use. If you keep it under that for your life, then chances are you're never going to develop atherosclerosis, at least not to a clinically relevant degree. So it won't even develop. Now, if you're somebody who has high blood pressure or blood sugar issues, or you've had high LDL cholesterol for most of your life, you want to go even lower. You want to drive that thing down as much as possible. And oftentimes for that, medication is needed, it's hard to get it down to those very, very low levels without medication. And some people might even need medication to get it into the ideal range. Otherwise, just based on genetic variability. And me, like being of South Asian descent, South Asians tend to have higher LDL cholesterol. So that's something to consider too. There are genetic influences. So those would be some of the main markers I would look at. If possible, though, I would measure that ApoB. So if you remember that protein on the LDL particle that interacts with the artery wall, you can actually directly measure that. And the reason that's a better marker is because in a percentage, I think it's about 20% of people, the LDL marker isn't super accurate. It can actually miss out on some of those atherogenic, some of those particles that can lead to atherosclerosis. And that's, people with metabolic syndrome, people with diabetes, perhaps people with just high triglycerides for whatever reason. It can skew the number a bit. So measuring that ApoB directly, make sure you capture every particle that could potentially lead to atherosclerosis. So I hope that's clear. I know that was a lot of information.
Well, let's go into each of those, because we hear these things thrown out there: blood pressure, cholesterol, especially, like everyone sort of knows about them, but they don't really know firstly what's good, but then what to do about it. Like what are things? What are like some red flags? Like, if 1.8 is the ideal, when is it a red flag? When is it in range? But maybe start with blood pressure. What does a high blood pressure mean? What does a low blood pressure mean? How do we get this in range? And what are some basic preventative stuff we can do?
So high blood pressure means that you just have a lot of pressure in the arteries. So a lot of pressure kind of pushing out on the arteries, and that can lead to some issues. It can lead to what's called a hemorrhagic stroke, perhaps, which is where you get like a bleed into the brain. So that's not good. Usually when it's very, very high. It can also lead to headaches that are caused from the pressure in the brain. It can increase your risk for a heart attack. Perhaps that pressure is pushing or shearing one of the plaques that have built up in the artery, and it's going to rupture off and cause a clot. That would be a heart attack. So it is a risk factor for a lot of these cardiovascular related issues. And one of the factors that seems to raise it is actually a high salt intake, sodium intake. So one of the easiest things for people to do is, well, maybe it's not so easy given how much salt is in our food, but one of the things that people can focus on is limiting their salt intake overall. And perhaps as long as they don't have kidney disease being one of the main risk factors, or as long as they're not on some blood pressure lowering medications that can raise their potassium levels. So obviously speak with your doctor about this, but you could potentially switch to a potassium-based salt. So rather than using a sodium chloride, which is going to raise blood pressure, you can use a potassium chloride, which lowers blood pressure. Again, I don't know how common that is or how easy it is to get that in the UK. I know here in Canada, you can get it pretty much any grocery store. But that's one really simple swap that has been shown to reduce stroke risk and reduce blood pressure and everything. But other things, there are foods that are seemingly really good for blood pressure. In fact, there's a whole dietary pattern called the DASH diet, which is dietary approaches for stopping hypertension. And so this is a very plant-based diet. It's very similar to a Mediterranean diet. So it's rich in fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds. They do have fish in there. You have some lean meats or white meats, and a modest amount of dairy products, if one were to have them. And that seems to help lower blood pressure as well. But amongst the different food groups, probably the best, or easily one of the best, is actually the legumes in particular. They seem to be really, really good for lowering blood pressure. So I do emphasize, intake of things like lentils and beans and tofu and whatnot if someone's looking to drop their blood pressure a bit.
And why is it that legumes help? What about them is
the exact mechanism? I'm not entirely sure, to be honest. It could potentially be a bit of the fiber. It could also be what it's replacing a lot of the time. So that's something you have to consider with nutrition, is like what are you eating it instead of? But just generally the clinical trial data that we have shows that they lead to a pretty good drop in blood pressure. And actually nuts and seeds are right up there as well. And especially things like ground flax seeds seem to be quite good. But you have to eat a fair bit of ground flax. Some of the best data we have are from like a quarter cup a day or something. So it's 2.5 tablespoons or whatever that works out to. So it's not a small amount.
Yeah, and then your calories are getting really high. So moving on to LDL then, and maybe ApoB, combine that in the sort of cardiovascular. When is it unacceptable, and when is it an emergency? Like you need to sort your diet out, and how much of it also is hereditary? Because I come from a family of high cholesterol in pretty much all my dad's side of the family. All the men have cholesterol issues. And I often wonder, I'm now 31, and I wonder to myself, how much can I prevent it versus, is it something I'm just going to have to deal with at some point?
Yeah. So there's cases of what's called familial hypercholesterolemia. So this is like purely genetic, very high cholesterol levels. In some cases, people have heart attacks in their 20s and 30s. Like that's how severe it is. Because one thing you have to consider, it's not just about how high your cholesterol is right now. That's almost never going to really matter. What matters is how high has it been and how many of these LDL or ApoB containing particles has your blood been exposed to over your life. It just adds up. You think about pack years of smoking, right? Like how many packs and multiplied by the years. You kind of think about that with cholesterol, like cholesterol years is one way that it's been phrased. And so in people, like familial hypercholesterolemia, affects about 1 in 250 people. So it's not crazy common, but it's not uncommon either. Like when you think of on a population basis, that's a fair number of people. And yeah, that runs in families. Now, there are people who don't have that genetic disease of familial hypercholesterolemia, but just still genetically, due to other genetic differences, have a higher than normal, so to speak, cholesterol. And if it does run in the family like that, if it's difficult to get it down with nutrition, and we'll talk about how to do that with nutrition in a bit here, then yeah, medication might be the way to go to drop that, because you do ultimately want to drop it as soon as possible and keep it there. So like the mantra with LDL cholesterol is typically the lower, the earlier, the longer, the better. That's what you're aiming for. And so how common it is to have a genetically elevated LDL that isn't due to familial hypercholesterolemia, I'm actually not sure on that specific stat, but I would assume it's not uncommon at all.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, like, I mean, when you think about infants, funny enough, we're generally born with a very, very, very low LDL, like a 0.5 to 1 millimole per liter or a 20 to 40 milligram per deciliter, but just kind of goes up throughout the life as well. And it'll continue to rise as we age. So that's another consideration too, which is why you definitely want to address it before it gets there.
So if we take away the genetics and hereditary factors, what are the reasons that people have high cholesterol?
Yeah, so then it largely comes down to diet. Now, you'll hear a lot of people talk about like weight loss or weight gain leading to high cholesterol and inactivity. Honestly, those variables have a pretty small effect. They might have an effect, but it's not large, surprisingly.
Really?
Now, yeah, weight gain, for example, might raise other markers, blood sugar especially, potentially triglycerides, but it's not necessarily affecting the LDL or ApoB, a ton. What seems to really affect it is actually saturated fat intake. So saturated fats that you're typically going to get from like high fat meat products, high fat dairy products. You get a little bit from some other foods, but those would be the main ones. That can raise your LDL cholesterol more than pretty much any other macronutrient. And replacing the saturated fats with polyunsaturated fats from things like nuts, seeds, liquid plant oils, so things like olive oil or canola oil. Actually, the olive oil is more monounsaturated fats, but it also lowers cholesterol relative to saturated fat. But like canola oil, sunflower oil, safflower oil, etc., those can really drive down the cholesterol. But when we live in a population where a lot of people are eating more of the butter and the meat and the fatty dairy products, then yeah, it's not super surprising that not a lot of people have ideal values. And when you switch to a plant-based diet, you're almost by default removing those foods that raise lipids, other than, I will say, coconut oil and palm oil. Those are high in saturated fat and can raise lipids as well.
Dark chocolate?
So dark chocolate's high in saturated fat, but it's a specific, so there are exceptions. There is nuance within this area.
Okay.
It's an exception because it contains a specific type of saturated fat called stearic acid. So that's the primary saturated fat in chocolate, and that seems to have a neutral effect. So it doesn't seem to raise lipids. Yeah. So that has more of a neutral effect. And then another one actually on the animal food side that seems to be a bit more neutral is actually cheese. So the exact reason why is unclear. It might be something to do with the calcium. It might be due to what's called the fat globule, and maybe it modifies how the saturated fat affects us. But while it can raise your LDL cholesterol and ApoB relative to like a non-fat cheese. So like a cheese where they remove a lot of the fat, probably doesn't taste very good, but they've done studies like that. And tofu, actually, they compared to tofu, then yeah, it still raises your numbers, just not as much as like a full fat milk would, and certainly not as much as butter would. So it's kind of a little more in the middle, but chocolate, I would say, is completely neutral based on what we know.
Is it a case of if you in your earlier years used to eat a lot of ribeye steaks, butter, coconut oil? Like for me, for 10 years in my bodybuilding career, I was eating a kilo meat a day. Before, but now I'm vegan, but back in the day it was kilo meat a day. It was always ribeye steaks. I used to pour butter all over the thing because I thought that was going to help my testosterone. These sorts of things. Like, is the damage already done, or is it reversible? So
you have to remember it's cumulative, right? So it is something that adds up over time. Now, I would bet, let's say, like, how many years would you say that you were eating a lot of the butter and the meat?
I'd say close to 10 years.
Yeah. So I would say it's actually likely that you have some plaque. And I'd say that's likely of most people within sort of our age group will have some plaque. How much is, questionable, depends on, again, how high their levels were. But the thing is, there's a lot you can do about reducing the amount of plaque you put on through the rest of your life. That's what you need to worry about. Yeah. And over time, the plaque stabilize as well. So you might have heard of like coronary artery calcium scores. I don't know if that's come up. Probably heard about it a bit. You can measure essentially how much of this calcified, this hard plaque you have. And generally speaking, the more of the calcified plaque that you have, especially in older age, the more plaque you have overall, and therefore the higher risk that you have. Because that calcified plaque's been there for a long time. But the thing is, the calcified plaque isn't actually really the problem. That is less likely to break off and cause a clot because it's calcified, it's hard. What is the problem are the softer plaques. So for example, if you take statins, like statin medications, and you lower your LDL cholesterol to a point that, say, you're not really, building up more plaque, you can actually increase your calcium score because the statins also help stabilize those plaques. And so not only does it prevent you from putting on more, it actually helps to hopefully prevent those plaques from rupturing and causing a clot in the first place. So people often misinterpret the calcium score thing, where it can actually be a good thing in some cases too. So basically, yeah, you've got some plaque there. That's going to be potentially an issue down the road, but you can stop yourself from building up more plaque, and hopefully over time those plaques stabilize and don't end up causing an issue. And if you're keeping your blood pressure in check, if you're keeping your weight and blood sugar control in check, you can really lower your risk of having an issue down the road. And so that's ultimately what you need to work on.
So when you mentioned around saturated fat being the key driver, is that if we're taking two 2,000 calorie diets, two lean people, one's having more saturated fat, one's having no saturated fat, can the cholesterol problem be very, very different in those two people? So you're saying it's independent of body composition and overall caloric macronutrient made up. It's purely that fat ratio.
That is one of the big ones. Now, other things that affect it, like fiber, for example, fiber can lower cholesterol as well, especially viscous fibers. So like the fiber in oats or eggplant or okra or those sorts of like gooier kind of texture fibers, that can also really lower cholesterol. There are definitely other factors that lower it. There's some research on green tea. So perhaps even the polyphenols in green tea can lower cholesterol a little bit. But by and large, the fat composition is probably the biggest driver from a dietary perspective. Now, if we take the example that you just gave, let's say we have two people. Let's say they're twins. So we know that genetically they're the same, right? Identical twins. One of them is eating 50 grams of saturated fat a day. One of them is, just having the kind of bare essentials of what you would get through like nuts and seeds and stuff. Say they're having like 10 grams a day. Yeah, they're going to have different lipids, and it's going to be much higher than the person eating more saturated fat. Let's say we take you and me. Now, I don't know what your levels are. I don't know your genetic background. But let's say we look at our diets, and I'm having very little saturated fat, and you're slamming the coconut ice cream or something, all the coconut oil or whatever, right? You're getting all this saturated fat in. It's conceivable that we have the same cholesterol levels because, let's say genetically I run higher than you, right? If genetically I have a higher level, I'm limiting my intake to keep it down to what my minimum is, and you have a genetically low level, but you're boosting it up with all the saturated fat, we're going to end up about the same. And so that's possible as well. And in fact, that's something that some of the meta-analyses on saturated fat intake and cardiovascular disease have kind of taken advantage of a little bit. I mean, I don't know if it's necessarily intentional or the researchers just don't know what they're doing, but what they'll do is they'll look at saturated fat intake and cardiovascular disease, but they'll do what's called an adjustment for LDL cholesterol levels. So they'll have people eating more saturated fat, people eating less saturated fat, and they'll be looking at cardiovascular disease risk. But by the way that they're doing these adjustments, they're essentially only looking at people with the same cholesterol levels. So they're making that mistake of, no, like that doesn't tell us an independent effect of saturated fat because you're lining everyone up so you're matched with people with the same LDL, right? And so it's like if A leads to B and B leads to C, but you just make sure everybody's B is the same, you're never going to see a difference between A and C. And so that's like when you see Butterer's back on Time Magazine and stuff, that's what it was based on, that kind of research. And so that's a huge mistake and a huge issue. So you can't do that. You have to look at higher saturated fat intake versus lower saturated fat intake in a population without adjusting for the main reason that saturated fat leads to cardiovascular disease. And when you do that, you see pretty consistently, there's an increase in risk, and it's not small. It is substantial. Talking 20 to even 30% potentially increase in risk of like a leading killer. That's significant.
I remember that whole butter and coconut phase, like especially in the and this is when I was really entrenched in bodybuilding in my early 20s. So maybe about 10 years ago, and butter and coconut was like the biggest thing around testosterone, good cholesterol. It was going to help you build more muscle. And there were some real big proponents of it, and I was slamming it down. Like, it was my only fat source. I stopped eating the other types of fats, just hammering the saturated fat, thinking it was going to help me build my body. And then obviously bulletproof coffee came about. You got pouring butter in there. Has that all gone wrong? Is that 100%. Is that a problem waiting to? Is that a heart attack waiting to happen?
Yeah, absolutely, it absolutely is. But here's the other problem. Is like I've kind of highlighted, these things take decades to develop. Heart disease takes decades. I know we aren't necessarily talking about cancer, but cancer takes decades to develop. A lot of these diseases, these chronic diseases, take decades to develop. But what you have people who are really good storytellers getting others on board saying, hey, I'm healthy after doing something for a couple of years. Even the big carnivore diet proponents, how long have they been carnivore? Their whole life? No, it's been like 5 years, maybe 10 years. And they're typically athletic. They're working out a lot. They're doing other things that help slow the progression of that disease down the road, but that doesn't mean they're going to wind up with problems later. And in fact, they likely are. I fully suspect that we're going to start to see people in that group, having issues, and that might take 10 years from now. We don't know. But sometime down the road, it's going to happen. And it's unfortunate because the people who are listening to them, they're not going to like these carnivore proponents, bulletproof proponents. They aren't going to be responsible for that. They have no accountability. It's going to be the doctors that are ultimately caring for them down the road that are going to have to save them from that issue. And you see it in a lot of the like carnivore Facebook groups and stuff. I mean, there's this Instagram account called Carnivore Cringe. I watch. It's kind of funny. But anyways, they join all these carnivore groups and they just post screenshots of what people are actually saying. And they'll be like, oh, I'm having all these issues. I'm having chest pain. I went to the doctor. I have this high blood pressure. I have a high cholesterol. They want to put me on drugs. And then there's people are commenting, you don't need the medications. Forget about cholesterol. It's fine. Don't worry about it. And like, that's going to be such an issue down the road.
Yeah. I was just thinking back to some of those. I mean, it was getting to the point where it was like a stick of butter a week. But anyway, you mentioned sunflower oils and various different oils in
seed oils.
In seed oils when you were talking. And again, in that same school of thought, those oils were thought of as the bad cholesterol and the bad oils. Yeah. What's the deal with oils and how we're meant to use them?
Yeah, so there's a huge like anti-seed oil camp, and it bleeds into all of those other areas I did, like the carnivore, the bulletproof, whatever. They all just kind of bash on seed oils. And so seed oils, I mean, it's not even a great term, honestly, but it's like all your classic vegetable oils, like the canola, safflower, sunflower, soybean, etc. I actually did a 4-hour debate on this on The Proof with Simon Hill. It was like episode 199 or no, maybe it was 200 and something. Anyways, 4-hour debate, if anyone wants to listen to it, with one of the leading proponents of the kind of seed oil camp, anti-seed oil camp. And what they largely based this on are a few trials that were done, a few decades ago, more than a few decades ago, where people were given a margarine that's made from seed oils, or they were given like saturated animal fats. And in some cases, the saturated animal fat group did better. Now, the issue with that is, and there are other issues, but the big issue with that is the margarines at that time had a lot of trans fats. So what they're doing is they're saying that, hey, these seed oils are the problem. It's like, no, it's the fact that there was a ton of trans fat in there that they're feeding to people that we didn't know. Like back in the 60s and stuff, we didn't know trans fats were bad. We learned that later. And so they're giving all these foods, and then, the trans fats are leading to problems, and more people have heart attacks on the seed oil or the margarine than they do with the animal fats. Now, one trial that this person I was debating could not reconcile, could not explain away the findings for, was called the LA Veterans Administration Hospital Study. So this was an 8-year randomized controlled trial. I can't even remember how many people, like 800 or 1,000 people, massive group for a trial like this. And they were largely like living in an institution. They were allowed to leave, but never really did. They were very old at this time, and they're all veterans. And they were randomized to one of two cafeterias. So one cafeteria, they have regular, animal fat based foods. Then the other one, they actually removed the saturated fat from food and infused it with seed oils. So they take like sausages, they'd like remove the saturated fat and infuse it with these polyunsaturated fats. They would take ice cream and like make it with the polyunsaturated fats. And before doing this trial, they actually did a small study to make sure people couldn't tell the difference, so that they were both enjoyable. So like they went above and beyond. It's one of the best trials ever done in nutrition, period. So they, had these people randomized to one or the other. They were eating those foods for a long time, for many, many years. As I said, it was like an 8-year trial plus a 2-year additional follow-up. And they measured their blood levels of those polyunsaturated fats, particularly the linoleic acid that's from the seed oils. And you can see that their levels were going up. So that they were eating those foods too. And at the end of the day, we see significant reductions in the risk of cardiovascular disease and in like an aggregate. So a bunch of different outcomes that would be related to diet. So they pooled a bunch together. And so whether we're looking at the overall kind of diet related outcomes or cardiovascular disease specifically, significant reductions. And I should also add that the participants didn't know which one they were getting. So it wasn't like they knew they were allocated to one or the other. It's like it was double blind. They didn't know. The researchers didn't even know until afterwards. And so it's phenomenal data. It's again, one of the best trials we have in nutrition, period. And I think that should put the nail in the coffin for a lot of these arguments that we hear about the seed oils, especially when compared to animal-based fats like butter and meats.
So sunflower, rapeseed oil, all these things are totally fine to use as part of your dietary intake. Absolutely, 100%. And in fact, rapeseed or canola oil can actually lower your LDL cholesterol, as we were talking about, even more than olive oil does. So it might even be preferable in some cases. So you've talked a lot. Go. No, I was going to say the one thing is like, look, if anybody's concerned still, even after all that, about seed oils, let's go for olive oil. It's a safe bet too. Like that's fine too. Just I would prefer that over the things like the butter and whatnot that are higher in the saturated fats. What are your thoughts on like Frylight sprays? The 1 cal sprays that people, I use them regularly. What's it made of? I don't think we have that here, to be honest. They are, I can do a quick Google whilst I'm wondering what the makeup is. Oh, the make is, it's called Frylight. And it's basically 1 cal sprays, and it has 51% extra virgin olive oil, water, alcohol, some emulsifiers, some natural flavorings, some thickeners. Oh, that sounds fine. Yeah, I wouldn't see. Now, I wouldn't expect that to necessarily have like lipid lowering benefits, like cholesterol lowering benefits, just because it sounds like the overall fat intake would be incredibly low. But I also don't see any harm there. From a calorie perspective, like if weight loss was a concern, I can see that potentially helping too. But yeah, I don't know if we have that over here. At least I haven't seen it over here. Okay. A lot of the things you've talked about, especially on a micro level, like for example, should you have seed oil or butter, and various different things. If you're playing the macro game, like the decade-long game that you mentioned, and this takes decades to do. What are like the broad recommendations that you give someone to help their BP, LDLs, ApoB, and set themselves up for as best a chance as possible?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I would say, honestly, dietary guidelines across the globe are pretty good. There are things I would tweak, but as a general kind of basis for a healthy diet, I think it's better than most iterations of most people's diets. But what I often recommend, and I would say this is what's probably associated with best outcomes, is 2 or more servings of fruit a day, 3 or more servings of vegetables per day, ideally one of them being a leafy green, dark leafy green. 3 to 5 or more servings of whole grains. So not your white flours and whatnot, but like we're talking whole wheat, brown rice, quinoa, oats, that sort of thing. Now for legumes, we see 400 grams, so about 4 servings a week, where the benefits seem to plateau. But for people who are eating strictly plant-based, I recommend 2 to 3 a day as far as serving sizes. So you can have like 2 servings in one meal pretty easily. And that's because it becomes a very important protein source for people who are strictly plant-based. If you aren't strictly plant-based, then like fish would be a good alternative for that. Nuts and seeds, at least a serving a day. And then if you want to use things like oils, we've talked about which oils are best on top of that. I would also recommend a calcium fortified plant-based milk, ideally, or calcium fortified food to make sure you're getting adequate calcium in. And then if you're eating strictly plant-based, then definitely vitamin B12. You can consider vitamin D depending on where you live, how much sun you get, and there are those considerations. But from a overall general health perspective, it's those 5 food groups that I really focus on. And then, of course, I tweak it a little bit based on the individual. And if someone's coming from a really standard American sort of diet, then I'm not even worried about serving or anything. I'm just like, okay, well, let's work on what of these can we get more of into your diet, and we'll take it one step at a time. If you're getting even a couple bites of each of these food groups, I think that's amazing, and you progress from there. But I just kind of gave the ideal.
Yeah, I mean, I noticed you didn't mention anything around dairy or eggs, but what's the evidence of those 2 food groups when it comes to chronic diseases?
Yeah, so for dairy, like dairy can be an important calcium source for sure, right? And that's why I mentioned like calcium fortified milk if you're doing a plant-based alternative. So calcium as a source, obviously important. For like say cardiovascular disease, we see that low-fat dairy products are generally protective. Full-fat dairy products, so like full-fat milks and that, generally increase risk. Yogurts seem to be more on the protective side though. And then cheese seems to be pretty neutral to even beneficial. And I kind of explained why there. It does depend on what you're swapping. So there was a study that found that swapping avocado for cheese, so eating avocado instead of cheese, could actually lower risk of cardiovascular disease as well. So you have to consider the comparison. But dairy is such a heterogeneous group. There's so many different types of dairy products that they actually affect risk differently. So that's kind of a really simple breakdown of what that would look like. Now with eggs, this is really interesting that you bring this up, because I've just had a back and forth with a dietitian about this after they made a American Egg Board sponsored post on social media. So that really bothered me. But anyways, eggs are an interesting one because we actually don't have a lot of really good data on populations where we have what's called a sufficient contrast in exposure. So what I mean by that is, in order to see if there's a benefit or a harm to a given food, you need to have in a population people with very low intakes and people with relatively high intakes. If the difference between low and high is like half an egg, well then of course you're probably not going to see much risk, right? You need to have at least about an egg a day, ideally, difference. And so when we look at the few cohorts that actually do that, or actually have that wide of a spread, and we have a couple in the US, we have one from Finland as well, we do see that about an egg a day increases risk of cardiovascular disease. Now, if you go further, you can look at replacement. So if you were to replace eggs with plant protein sources, you generally see that the plant protein sources are better. So eggs raise risk relative to those. But if you look at eggs relative to like red meat, for example, well, then eggs seem to be better. So that's another thing to consider. Are you someone who's trying to reduce red meat intake and eggs are your go-to? Then you might actually lower your risk, and that might be a better option for you. But if you're eating plant-based, you're eating a lot of plant protein, and you're thinking if you should add eggs back in, well, that might actually be to your detriment, depending on how much you're eating, if you are having like that one a day kind of average. So that's really important. And one reason that I think eggs are so confusing is because they're really rich in cholesterol, but they're relatively low in saturated fat, like not a ton of saturated fat. And as we've talked about, saturated fat is the big one that you got to worry about. Now with dietary cholesterol, it does still affect your LDL, but not in a straight line. It's not like the more cholesterol you eat, the higher your LDL cholesterol gets. What happens is if you take a vegan who eats no cholesterol because there's no animal foods, and you start adding cholesterol to their diet, their LDL can actually shoot up a fair bit. But then if you take someone who's already eating a lot of cholesterol and you add more, it kind of plateaus around just over 2 eggs worth of cholesterol. And so you have to consider that too. If you're already eating a not very healthy diet, we'll say, or you're eating a ton of these animal foods and you're starting to add more eggs to it, it's probably actually not going to do much. Whereas if you were to take a healthier dietary pattern that's more plant-based and add more eggs to it, it could actually be more detrimental in that case. So at least to your lipids. And so that's just a little bit of nuance that I think people don't fully understand, at least those who seem to want to exonerate eggs.
It's the comparative effect that's really interesting. I think that's probably where the benefits of eggs have come from, because they're compared essentially up
compared
against
to what?
meat.
Yeah. Compared to what is the most important question in nutrition. If anybody ever cites something as like, finding of a food being beneficial or harmful or whatever, you just have to ask, what was it compared to? And that will give you the answer as to, whether or not it is, net beneficial compared to most things, or if it's just compared to specific foods. And, because food's on a spectrum from healthiest to least healthiest.
And how does it work with the ketogenic diet? Because you've actually published an article today, I think, or last week on.
Oh, in my newsletter, yeah.
On your newsletter around the ketogenic diet, and it was a really good breakdown of how it's done right and how it's done wrong. We get a lot of questions around the ketogenic diet, as I'm sure you get asked all the time. Mm-hmm. As a headline summary, is it good? Is it bad? Is it dangerous?
So it really depends. So obviously the ketogenic diet was first implemented to treat intractable epilepsy. So these are cases of epilepsy where medications aren't really doing their job. And in that case, you're maybe a little more desperate to try some stuff. And this seems to be one option that does work. Now there's a specific iteration of the ketogenic diet that has been used for medical purposes, and it's even more restrictive than the typical ketogenic diet, as like people in the fitness circles or whatever will do. Now, my concern with people adopting ketogenic diets is that they often do a very animal-based, very high saturated fat version. And in fact, we have a study that came out a couple of years ago on these are healthy young women who were put on either, I think it was Swedish dietary guidelines. So I think the study was done in Sweden, but like the dietary guidelines, overall healthy diet, or a animal-based keto diet. So what, most people are probably doing. And man, their LDL cholesterol shot up like crazy high. And in some cases, theirs got so high that it could be mistaken for a familial hypercholesterolemia. Wow. Like that's how bad it was. Obviously, this was a short-term trial, so it's not going to lead to issues. They can get off the diet and get back to normal levels, but still like scary as far as someone maintaining that long term. Now, we don't have long follow-up data on people eating a keto diet at this point, a truly keto diet and the risk of cardiovascular events down the road. But we do have research on what's considered a more low-carb diet and or a more low-fat diet and vice versa. And generally speaking, low-carb diets tend to increase risk, particularly if they're more focused on animal-based foods. So if you're eating more animal fat and animal protein and reducing carbohydrates, that seems to increase risk of cardiovascular disease. But if you're going the other way and you're eating more plant fat and plant protein while reducing carbohydrate intake, that can actually be beneficial, especially if you're replacing refined carbohydrate intake with more of those plant proteins and plant fats. So there are different iterations. I would say for anyone who is trying to do a low carb or even ketogenic approach, focusing on more unsaturated fats is definitely from especially plant sources or fish if you're having animal sources. That is going to be the ideal way to do it versus doing the super high saturated fat iteration.
What was the LDL levels out of interest in that?
Oh man, I can't remember. I can just picture the graph. So they in the graph, I can maybe send this to you. You can put it in the notes for people who want to see, but they have the before and after of every participant, all these different lines on the graph. Yeah. And there was a couple that were just like so high off the charts. Like it was crazy. But that sort of a difference from a dietary change is like wild to see. So, but I can't remember the specific number.
And just to close that loop on cholesterol, is it, you said 1.8 is what you want to get underneath it. What is the sort of middle ground and what's that you need to go sort this out now?
So the upper range of like normal is about 3.4. It changes a little bit depending on where you are. I've seen blood test for people around the world, and it's a little bit different. We'll say about 3.4. But within that normal range, so let's say even from around that, like 1.5 is like the low end of normal. So let's say from 1.5, as we go up within the normal range to 3.4, we see that atherosclerosis increases. The rate of atherosclerosis increases. We have a good study from it's called the PISA cohort. And this study showed that in people without other risk factors, these are healthy people who don't have any symptoms of heart disease. If you actually measure the plaque in their artery, you see that as you go from the lowest levels to the highest levels in the normal range, the amount of plaque increases. Or the risk of having plaque and the number of sites that you find plaque increases. And so that just goes to show we want to be at the lower end of normal, ideally even below that cutoff for low if you can, and then keep it there for as long as possible. As far as where to address it, like right now, I mean, certainly if it's elevated, like out of the normal range, I'd say, yeah, you really want to address that now. If you're kind of high normal or like just barely above the normal range, you can, try dietary intervention first, see how much you can do with nutrition, and then maybe consider medication if needed. But certainly if you're way up there, then I would be working really hard to drop that as quick as possible, whether that is, of course, with medication, nutrition, or ideally both.
Okay. A lot of people may be listening to this thinking, well, Dr. Matthew's vegan. So, he's been talking about plant-based diet throughout this whole episode. Is there would the same recommendations be given if you weren't vegan? What would you say to that?
Well, look, I've praised the health benefits of fish multiple times now. Fish, low-fat dairy products, I said, can be beneficial. Yeah. I think bivalves, although they aren't necessarily sentient either, there's debate around that, so might not even be an ethical concern. But yeah, I think there are healthy animal foods, and I have no issue saying that. And that's why, like within what I've discussed, I say that if you eat animal products, then fish is the one to go for. Perhaps low-fat dairy is the one to go for. Any
fish, white fish, fatty fish?
Yeah, I mean, fatty fish for more of the polyunsaturated fats would probably be ideal. Yeah. But I wouldn't be too concerned. I mean, not fried fish. Let's put that off the table. But otherwise, I think those are fine. But I have an ethical issue with what we do to animals, right? I want people to connect the dots and stop eating animal foods because of that, not because they're concerned about the health implications of all animal products. Yeah, some stuff like red meat you really want to limit, ideally as little as possible or under a couple servings a week. But for other things like fish and that you could be more, say, lenient with from a health perspective, I don't extend that lenience to the ethical considerations and perhaps even environmental considerations.
What does a good non-omnivorous diet look like compared to a really well executed plant-based diet?
Okay. Yeah. So that's a good question. So it would be, if I were to outline, you want me to give you like a sample day, what it might look like maybe? Is that better than just like highlighting food groups? Yeah. So like if we're talking about breakfast, I'd say, breakfast, I'd probably consider similar, like do an oatmeal or something in both cases. For lunch, maybe you do a whole wheat sandwich for the vegan diet, a whole wheat sandwich with like tofu and avocado, some sprouts, some tomato. And then maybe on the omnivorous side, it's kind of the same thing, but you might include a little bit of like lean white meat perhaps, or maybe a little bit of fish if you wanted, perhaps even a slice of cheese, because as I talked about, cheese is maybe a little less of a concern. And then for the dinner, I don't know, maybe a big Buddha bowl type thing, where in one case you've got for the vegan, say some quinoa, mixed veggies, you got your beans or chickpeas or lentils, whatever sauce you're using on that. And then in the other case, maybe they combine it with some fish or something. I think there's a lot of, it's not that different. It's just like, little different. And then I was going to say for the plant, for the calcium side, in one case, maybe you do a skim milk for the omnivorous side, and you do a fortified soy milk on the plant-based side.
And would the health benefits be any different there? Like, are you at a disadvantage being plant-based?
I don't think they'd be measurable. So if there are differences at all, one way or another, I think they'd be so small that you wouldn't pick up on that on like a study. I mean, you'd have to have a ridiculous amount of participants for a ridiculously long follow-up in order to pick up on a difference. And we do see that in like the Seventh-day Adventist cohorts. We see that pescatarians, vegans, vegetarians, they all do similarly really well. We don't really see significant differences between them. So I think either case could be reasonable from a health perspective.
Yeah, it's really good to know. And you mentioned soy, and I know you said earlier today you were meant to debate someone who was going to tell you why soy is bad, but he didn't turn up.
He did not. Yeah.
If you were to give 3 points why the listeners should consider soy in their diet, whether they eat meat or not, what would they be? What are some of the really good benefits?
Yeah. So for one, a good food for lowering cholesterol, as we've talked about a lot. There's actually clinical trials showing it lowers blood pressure as well, but I'll compile that under one of the benefits. The other benefit, I think, is very, very high quality protein. So a lot of protein per calorie. So that's really good to consider. Also, I don't think it matters all that much, to be honest, but when you consider amino acid profile and digestibility, foods like tofu tend to do really well. So that's another consideration for the protein quality. And then third, just overall nutrition, like it's pretty rich in calcium. Obviously, there's calcium set versions as well, which are even higher. It gives you a little bit of iron as well, depending on the type of soy. So if it's tofu, maybe not so much, but if you're doing like edamame or tempeh, you get a decent amount of fiber with that as well. So nutritionally, it's also quite a good food.
Are there any cons to consider in terms of how much you eat of soy? Or is there?
I'm honestly not really worried about it. My main concern with, the too much soy type arguments is not, the hormonal concerns. I mean, we have meta-analyses of randomized controlled trials where some of the doses were like 4 or 5 servings a day and it was fine. But my main concern would be that if you're eating a ton of soy, you're reducing the diversity in your diet. So you're probably not getting a lot of the other benefits. Like, remember, I went over those 5 groups and how many servings of each you ideally want to hit. If you're eating, 10 servings of soy, you're probably not getting a lot of those other foods. And so you want to have that variety to make sure you're hitting each of those as much as you can anyway.
And from a supplement perspective for plant-based diets, what are your go-tos? You mentioned B12 earlier and vitamin
D. B12 for sure. Now you could rely on fortified foods if you're super consistent with it, at least 2 to 3 times a day. I just tend to say do a supplement, so much easier, and you don't have to worry about it. Vitamin D, I think for the UK, probably important. Here in Canada, definitely important. So that's one to consider. Iodine, maybe. So if you're not using an iodized salt, then perhaps supplementing iodine might be a consideration. I just typically recommend people use iodized salt, and about half a teaspoon a day does the trick. Or if you have high blood pressure, you're limiting salt, another reason to perhaps choose a supplement. Maybe calcium if calcium intake is really low. I know we've talked about using fortified milks and stuff, but some people don't want to rely on that, and that's fine. I think totally fair. And in that case, maybe you consider upping calcium a little bit that way. But otherwise, I'm not too concerned. I know there's some talk around omega-3s, and I think as a precautionary measure, supplementing long chain omega-3s, so the type of omega-3s you would typically get from fish, but you can get from algae-based supplements, is a decent consideration. Although I wouldn't say the research is super convincing at this point for a benefit, but there's possible benefits for heart health or brain health. And if there's possible benefit and you can afford the cost that's typically a bit higher for those types of supplements, I think it's a reasonable one to consider, but I just wouldn't hang my hat on there definitely being significant benefits.
Amazing. Well, I think there's been a lot of packed value in this session. I think a lot of people might need to re-listen and take some notes on some of the key health markers. Just to finish off some quick fires, potential myths of like yay and nay. Is creatine worth it?
100%. I love it. For muscle, and strength, actually strength gains in particular, muscle gains, it doesn't add too much muscle, but definitely creatine is really good for that. Possible brain benefits, like as far as memory and that, but it's the research isn't great in that respect. And there's some research suggesting it might lower cholesterol a little bit. It might help with bone mineral density a little bit, particularly in at-risk women. So I think it's a good idea.
Artificial sweeteners?
Totally safe, fine, no concerns. The best available research on the topic suggests that they're beneficial compared to sugar and pretty neutral compared to not using them. So I know there's a lot of fear mongering out there, but it's based on a complete misunderstanding. Like the New World Health Organization Class 2B classification of aspartame has spurred a lot of controversy. But guess what? Pickled vegetables, aloe vera, ginkgo biloba, they're all in that same category. And that's because they theoretically could cause cancer. Like pickled vegetables, if you eat a ton of them, because of the sodium content, it can cause stomach cancer. But the thing is, you just don't eat that much and it's fine. So we have to look at what is the dose and does it lead to risk at the doses that are consumed? And in this case, no, artificial sweeteners are, in my opinion.
Is it worth buying organic food?
No, I don't think so at all. I think it's a marketing gimmick for the most part, to be honest. We have a couple cohorts looking at outcomes in people choosing organic versus not choosing organic. And we see pretty much a wash as far as health outcomes go. So I don't see a good reason to choose organic over non-organic. I know it's probably going to spark some controversy, but that's what the data shows. So yeah. And then, by the way, organic food is sprayed with stuff anyway, and often sprayed with more because the natural pesticides aren't as effective. So, take from that what you will.
And coffee, is it good or bad for you?
It's awesome. Now, obviously, in pregnancy, you want to limit because of the caffeine content. If you are somebody who is prone to like anxiety from caffeine consumption, yeah, and that's another reason to limit it. But generally speaking, it lowers risk of cardiovascular disease, lowers risk of diabetes, might lower risk of some types of cancers. It's just pretty beneficial across the board. And it's a huge dose of those polyphenols that seem to be promoting a lot of those benefits.
You put limits on it, or are you?
So what's really funny is we see benefits up to like huge doses. Like we see benefits up to anywhere from like 5 to 8 cups a day worth. Like it's crazy.
Caffeinated.
So yeah. So these are measured cups though. So like, one drink might be 2 cups, right? You have to consider that. But really the limit that is set would be more so based on an individual. Like, so again, if you are someone who reacts to caffeine and gets jittery or anxious, then yeah, you don't want to be consuming that much. You want to be limiting that, but for other people, they can tolerate it a lot better and it's fine. So I think that is just an individual decision as far as how much to limit. And obviously having some late in the day affect your sleep, that kind of thing too. But generally speaking, no, I don't really care as far as the limit on it. I think it's just beneficial.
I was really surprised to see your video about coffee and dehydration.
Everyone thinks it's dehydrating. That's not true based on the best data.
Do you want to give it like a quick 30 seconds on that? Because I thought that's fascinating. I was honestly like, yes. I always thought, hydrate before you caffeinate, that mantra.
Yeah, so there's this concern that that drinking coffee is diuretic. It's going to lead to you losing water. Well, for starters, like just on face value, when you're drinking coffee, you're drinking fluids. So even if you're peeing out more fluids, you're still taking in fluids. So it's not like it's going to dehydrate you. So that's one. Now, but that aside, it doesn't actually seem to increase output. We have studies on very highly caffeinated coffee. So they actually add a bunch of caffeine to it. That's like having several cups versus a like regular coffee, for example. And we don't see differences in output, urinary output or markers of hydration. And there are multiple studies that have done this since. I think there was one study where they looked at what was the equivalent of like 6 cups of coffee in 1 cup or something like, or like 3 energy drinks worth in 1 cup of for caffeine. And in that case, there was like a slight increase in like sodium excretion or something. Like that was it. And that's at an insane dose in 1 drink. Like you'd be having it really quick, right? Not spread out throughout the day. So I see no reason to be concerned about it.
Amazing. Where can people find out more about your work?
Yeah, you can check me out on Instagram. That's where I'm most active. Actually, just passed 50K, so that was really cool. Saw that this morning. And you can sign up for my newsletter. I know you talked about the ketogenic diet article that was just published in there. I kind of put one out a month. So it's not, you're not going to get flooded with emails from that. It's just like once a month. And of course, if you have any questions, you can message me. If you happen to be in British Columbia, Canada, for whatever reason, you can book in with me even for a consultation. But I'm guessing there probably aren't too many Vancouverites.
Are you available online?
Yeah, but only in BC because I'm only registered in BC.
Okay, so, interesting.
So like I still only see people within the province, but I can see them who are living 5, 6, 7 hours away from me. I can still work with them online.
Amazing. Well, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. It's been a pleasure, and I've learned personally a lot. So thank you.
Awesome. All right, thank you.